Well, I shared with you all a couple weeks ago that in the year 2013, Trina and I had been married just over a year, and one of the great things we got to do together before kids came along is within the span of a year, we got to write, direct, and actually act in 3 different plays. And the third and the biggest of those productions was a play called Esther, Queen of Persia. And I say it was the biggest because we had the biggest cast, we had the most amount of props, it was the longest, it was a full script. The play went something like an hour and a half long. We even brought in some musicians to write us some original music for it, so it was a bit of a musical. It was this sprawling spectacle that was so much fun to be a part of. But it was a lot of work. So writing the script, directing it, making sure everyone's where they need to be, even acting in it. I got to play the role of Xerxes. Trina got to play the role of Haman's wife, Zeresh. Trina, by the way, plays a great villain, if you ever need someone to play a villain. Not like her in real life, but as an actress, man, fantastic. Now, when we did this play about Esther, though, I'll tell you, there were so many exhausting details necessary to pull it off. There were so many details you had to coordinate. Every line of the script had to be written just the right way. You had to make sure that these costumes were prepared in such a way that this person was doing their job, that this was ready for that this mic was ready to be traded out, that these props would be traded out at this particular section. There were so many minute details that it took every second of our free moment to have this thing work out. And there's always something that slips through the cracks. There's always some detail you overlook. In order to have a perfect show, in order to operate the story perfectly, you not only need to have a great script, everything's got to come to its conclusion, all the character arcs have to come to a satisfactory close, the songs all have to tie in nicely, everything has to come together on a story level. And then of your props, everything's got to be exactly where it has to be, or else entire scenes may not happen. You've got to make sure that costumes are done and people are able to swap out those costumes within sometimes a matter of mere moments. And with that many details, there are so many things that could go wrong. And like always happens in show business, something inevitably always did. There was always, by God's grace, it went well, but there was always something that didn't quite go perfectly. And in fact, in hindsight, when I look back on it, we have a really embarrassing video of the play that we'll watch sometimes. And when you watch it, you're like, oh, should have done that better. Oh, that wasn't as strong as it could have been. Man, I think we kind of messed up in that. When you look back at the orchestration, you realize I didn't orchestrate that as well as I could have. Well, how much more is the genius required to write the real story of Esther? Because there is a writer and a director and an officiant over this story of Esther. And it was no mere human author or producer. It was, in fact, Almighty God. And the story of Esther is so brilliant because there are so many moving parts to it. There's so many plot twists. There's so many characters. There's so many things that come about. There's so many interweaving parts that come to this grand conclusion. It would take an act of sheer divine genius to orchestrate all of those details perfectly without looking back and saying, yeah, that could have been better. And yet that's exactly what we find. So doing a play of Esther is fun, but the real story takes divine orchestration. And that's exactly what we see. What we see in the story of Esther is the doctrine of divine providence. That behind the scenes of this story, there is a divine director who is writing and working out all details according to his good plan and is bringing everything to its proper conclusion. As we go through this book, we will see God's providence on prime display. God is the one invisibly operating through every twist and turn of the story. He's like the people behind the curtain, that you don't see them, you don't visibly perceive that they're there, but it would not happen without them making it happen. You know, last week, as we came to our finale in the book of Colossians, we discussed how Christ and his grace can use his simple, imperfect people to do great things. But you know what stands out to me about the story of Esther, and even the first chapter today, is that Jesus doesn't only use his own willing, submissive people. His sovereign brilliance goes so deep that he even uses those who are not his people and even those who have no regard for his will, whether it be a villain like Haman or even a pompous, arrogant monarch like Ahasuerus. History is full of corrupt rulers doing corrupt things. And God is not the author of corruption. God does not approve of sin. But in this great mystery of providence, he sovereignly brings about his good plan through these corrupt rulers, eventually culminating in the gospel of Jesus Christ. Behind all of these stories and behind all of these characters, there stands a sovereign director who is using all things, even the corruption of man, to bring about his good cause. And as we'll see, the story of Esther is not separate from the gospel of Christ. If the story of Esther doesn't happen, the gospel doesn't happen. We'll come to that by the end of the sermon. Now, I've said it before, the first sermon in a series is always the most challenging because I really feel like I'm trying to fit two sermons into one. On one hand, I want to give due space to introducing the book, its themes and its background, its context, that sort of stuff. But I also want to dig into the text and have something applicable for the church from the text as well. So I'm going to attempt to once again sort of squeeze two different trains of thought into this one message. May the Lord give me grace to do what seems impossible. Let's go to our first point. Let's consider the introduction to Esther. And a couple things we consider here. First is the context and the authorship. In what place and in what setting is this written? Well, a little background for you, if you know your biblical history. In the year 586 BC, the land of Judah and the city of Jerusalem had been conquered by King Nebuchadnezzar, and he hauled them off into captivity in Babylon. Well, in 539, Babylon was itself conquered by Medo-Persia, led by a ruler named Cyrus the Great. And so all that had belonged to Babylon now came into the hands of the Persians. And that included the land of Israel, but also all the Israelite exiles who were living in Babylonian territory. Now, Cyrus the Persian was very diplomatic. And so he allowed all the exiles to return back to their homeland if they wish. The Old Testament chronicles this. There's also a real historical artifact called the Cylinder of Cyrus that you can look up, and it's historical documentation that Cyrus really did give this edict for the exiles to return home. And so many of the Jews who had been taken from their land went back to Jerusalem. But there were many who chose to stay. Now, why is that? Well, think about it. They had been there for about 70 years. And so there are Jews there who are born and raised in this land. They know Israel is sort of their motherland, but they've never actually lived there. This terrain is their home. Mesopotamia is all that they've ever known. So while they might still be ethnically and religiously Jewish, they maintained their residency in Persia. Well, Cyrus died in 530 BC, and he was succeeded for a few years by his son, and then came a man named Darius the Great in 522 BC. And due to the massive sprawling size of the Persian Empire, Darius came up with this brilliant idea of dividing the kingdom into 20 what are called satrapies. And he appointed a satrap or a governor over each one of these, ruling under him. And then each of those were divided into smaller territories, etc. Well, Darius died in 486 BC, and his son, Ahasuerus, ascended the throne. And that's the same Ahasuerus that we read about today. Now, we typically remember Ahasuerus by his Greek name, Xerxes. Now, throughout this study, I may use Ahasuerus and Xerxes interchangeably, so I ask your forgiveness in advance. The reason is that the text sticks true to the original language and uses Ahasuerus. We often refer to him as he's well known, Xerxes. So if you hear either of those names, know it's referring to the same person. Now, Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, the action in which his reign takes place here is about the year 483 BC. He comes to the throne in 486. We read here in verse 3 that this begins in the third year of his reign, so that places us in the year 483 BC. And at this time, Persia is the world superpower. You've got some Israelites back in the Holy Land, you've got some still living in Persia. That's our context of the story. What about authorship? Who wrote this story? Well, we actually don't know because there's no name attached to it. Some Jewish traditions ascribe authorship to Mordecai himself. Others have suggested Ezra or Nehemiah, who were well-known writers and leaders at that time. But whoever it was, we can affirm two things about them pretty confidently. One, they were Jewish. That they're concerned with exploring the backstory of the Jewish festival of Purim. And they show obviously strong sympathy to the Jews here, to the Israelites. So they were probably Jewish. But then secondly, whoever the author is, they probably spent extensive amount of time in Persia. And they wrote this book fairly soon after the events. Why do I say that? Because when you read through this, even just what we read in chapter 1, they show very personal familiarity with Persian culture, with Persian customs, and even with the particulars of Xerxes' court. So whoever wrote it probably lived in that setting, was perhaps even an eyewitness of these events. Now, next question we can ask, subpoint B, is this fiction or history? This is one of the biggest debates surrounding the book. There's really three camps. about how to treat Esther. The first group says this is actual history. This is a chronicle of what really went down. The second group says, no, it's based on historical events, but it sort of got some legendary details added to it over time. And then the third group says, no, this is total historical fiction. It has a totally made-up plot placed in a historical context, kind of like the story Ben-Hur. Right? So the story of Ben-Hur takes place in a real historical context surrounding the events of the Passion in Jesus' life, but Ben-Hur is a totally made-up character. It never happened. Now, we could get a lot into the details about why people think that this is historical or not historical. For time's sake, we probably won't dig too much into that here. We may have something posted on our website or Facebook later this week where we can dig into that a little bit more if that sort of thing interests you. I'm just going to give you 3 quick reasons why I think Esther is real history. Firstly, because it reads like the author wants us to treat it as real history. The authorial intent, written by this person who lived very close to the events, writes as though it really happened. He uses real names, real places, real years, and he shows a firsthand familiarity, again, with the culture and court of Persia. It also is providing a historical backstory for the Jewish holiday called Purim. And the Jews all believed that their holidays were based on real historical events. And I would agree. So you think about the Passover, you think about the Feast of Tabernacles. Those were all based on real historical events. And so I think there's no reason to think why the origins of Purim aren't similar. Another reason why I think this is real history is that the portrayal of Xerxes' character and many of the details in this story, such as him having 7 court advisors, the names of some of his court officials, the prominence of Susa, the use of marble in its architecture, the king extending his scepter to show favor, all of those things are corroborated by other historical documents that show this is dealing with very accurate information. But then the third reason why I think this is history is that at the end of the book, in Esther chapter 10, verse 2, it says this: all the acts of Mordecai's power and might, and the full account of the high honor of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? So the author is writing this very close to the events, and he's saying, hey, if you want more details about this, if you want to know more about Mordecai and everything, isn't that chronicled for you? Can't you just walk into your local Persian library and read it for yourself? So with this being written so close to the events, it seems highly unlikely that the author would say, hey, go check out these official Persian documents to corroborate my story, if no such documents existed. But whatever they were, they've been lost to time. So I think we can affirm this is a real story and God was really working through these characters. But what is the purpose and themes of this book? That's subpoint C. I would say there's 4 main purposes of this book. One is to explain the origin of the Jewish holiday called Purim. Purim means lots. And it comes from the part of the story where Haman wants to destroy the Jews, but he's not sure what day. So pick a day, any day. I'll cast lots, and wherever the lots fall, that's the day I'm going to pick to annihilate them. And so that word lots actually came to be used to commemorate this event itself. And that holiday is still celebrated today in Jewish communities. The second reason or purpose for this book is to show God's continuing work among his people, even when they're far away in exile. Remember, many Israelites have returned to the promised land, but many have not. Many are still in foreign territory. And so you might wonder, with them being that far away from Jerusalem, are they outside of God's care? Have they exceeded the borders of God's provision for his people? To which Esther is a resounding no. God takes care of his people wherever they may be. Thirdly, to demonstrate the mystery of providence. Now, one of the things that the book of Esther is a little infamous for is that it never features the name God once. There's no direct mention of God or the temple or prayers or the covenant or anything religious. That actually troubled some early Jews, and that's why I mentioned earlier there's a Greek version of Esther that the scribes went back and they added explicit references to the covenant Lord because it made them uncomfortable that he wasn't explicitly mentioned. Now, I think exactly the way God gave it is perfect because I think that this is a genius literary way of magnifying God's behind-the-scenes work. Think about it. He's not mentioned, but his fingerprints are everywhere. Esther demonstrates God to us a bit like the wind. You can't always see him, but the effects are undisputed. This story is full of ironies, twists, coincidences, and certain details falling into such perfect place that it blasts divine design on every single page. What a better way to demonstrate the invisible providence of God than to show rather than tell. In fact, that's one of the keys of good writing. Don't just tell, show. And it's almost like the author of Esther was saying, I'm going to show God's providence in action. When you read this with a biblical worldview, you can come to no other conclusion but that, wow, God is really powerfully at work in every detail of this story. You don't see or hear him directly, but the perfect coincidences of the story leave no doubt he is the one sovereignly orchestrating it. The fourth point of this story is this: the preservation of the messianic line. This is something that I think gets really overlooked, and as Christians, we need to really dig this out. Since God's providence is so strong to bring the story to the conclusion that he desires, what is God's reason for that providence? What is God doing here? Well, initially, he's preserving the salvation, or he's preserving the salvation of this nation, Israel. He's saving them, keeping them in existence. But I think there's a deeper reason for it. God is safeguarding the people of Israel. Why? Because it was through Israel that God had promised he would bring the Messiah of the world. It was through Abraham's descendants that the seed of Abraham would be born. It was through the line of David that the eternal king would be born. If Israel gets annihilated, Jesus is never born. Keep that big picture perspective in mind. What's at stake here is way bigger than just one nation. It's the fate of the entire world. Because if the Jews get annihilated, Jesus never comes, and you are sitting dead in your sins right now. So keep that big picture in mind. All right, let's go on to point number 2 today, and now we can begin digging into the text. The main character in chapter 1, the guy who dominates most space, is King Ahasuerus. And so we're going to consider him as the crooked king. And we're going to see that he is a bit of a rascal. He is not a very wise king, he's not a very fair king, and he's certainly not always a very good king. Now, the Persian rulers during this time had a nickname for themselves they were very fond of. They like to call themselves the King of Kings. Where have we heard that before? So keep in mind that Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, is operating with this assumption: I am the King of Kings. A couple things we could see about him. First, subpoint A. In verses 1 through 3, we see the vast power of Ahasuerus. It says that he reigned from India to Ethiopia. We know historically that his reign covered about 2 million square miles, which at the time was the largest empire in world history. And actually, a lot of people don't realize this, that his empire was actually bigger than the Roman Empire even would be. So even Rome doesn't quite get as big as Xerxes' empire was. We don't know the exact size of the world population at that time, but estimates are as high as 44% of the world's population at that time was included under the territory of Xerxes' reign. So he covers a lot of space. And this did not happen by accident. This was a very intentional ambition of his. One of the historical sources we know about Xerxes from was a Greek historian by the name of Herodotus. Herodotus wrote a book called The Histories. He's kind of considered the grandfather of historians. And he wrote it sometime between 440 and 425 BC. Listen to what Herodotus said. This is a quote from Xerxes in this history book. He says, "From the day on which I mounted the throne, I have not ceased to consider by what means I may rival those who preceded me and increase the power of Persia. We shall extend the Persian territory as far as God's heaven reaches. The sun will then shine on no land beyond our borders. We shall bring all mankind under our yoke, alike those who are guilty and those who are innocent." So Xerxes, Ahasuerus' plan is nothing less than world domination. He's sort of revitalizing that old plan of the Tower of Babel, all the way up to heaven. That's as high as my empire is going to go. And the context of the story here is that he is sitting on his royal throne, verse 2 tells us, in Susa. Susa was a major city in what is today called Iran. Now, for as impressive as we're about to read some pretty impressive descriptions of the citadel here at Susa, but keep in mind, this is actually just Xerxes' winter home. because where Susa got really hot in the summertime, so he couldn't stay there in the heat of summer. But he would say that he was basically a snowbird. And so this was just his second home. And it's referred to as a citadel. A citadel served two purposes. It served as both a palace and as a fortress. It was usually elevated, and it had all the flair and beauty of a palace, but it had the strong, safe walls of a fortress. Now, the Persians didn't leave many written records behind like the Greeks did, but the Persians did leave behind some pretty giant feats of stone architecture. And so we can learn a lot about what Susa was like and what Persian cities were like. It was grand. It was intricate. It was artistic. If you were to stand in a place like Susa in its prime, it would have taken your breath away. And that is the power of this Xerxes. Subpoint B, the rich splendor of Ahasuerus in verses 4 through 9. It says there that he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days. In other words, he's got a lot of cool toys and he's showing them off. I'm going to go back to Herodotus again because he describes a really funny scene. So in this particular scene, Xerxes had been warring with the Greeks for a while, and he couldn't overcome them. So Xerxes up and he returns to his own country, but he leaves behind the tent he had been staying in with all its furnishings. And this is what you would call a war tent. So this is not supposed to be some elaborate palace. It's supposed to be a place you're bunking out in with the troops while you're waging war. Xerxes' war with the Greeks doesn't work out. He goes home. He leaves behind the tent, and he leaves behind all the stuff inside the tent. And so after Xerxes leaves, a couple of the Greeks go inside, and what they find there makes them laugh, because they find furniture and furnishings of gold and silver, and everything is decked out. So Xerxes apparently liked glamping more than camping. And the Greeks start making fun of him because he has a flair for the fabulous. They're like, here's this supposed warlord staying in a tent, and he's decked it out, and he's made it, he's what a prima donna. And they're kind of making fun of him for being such a fabulous pretty boy. Now, if that was just, and think about with the flippant way he treats this stuff. He leaves this stuff behind like it's leftover garbage. Golden and silver furniture that you and I would say, oh, my problems are solved, like this would be great. And for him, it's like a candy wrapper that he leaves behind. And if that was just his tent, imagine what his palace was like. Now, it says in verse 4 that he basically shows off his fancy toys for 180 days. That's 6 months. That's half a year. A little excessive. Now, this probably doesn't mean that everybody dropped what they were doing and spent just 6 months partying. I mean, an empire would fall apart if he did that. What it probably means is that he made this very intentional exhibit of all of his splendor, and there's sort of a revolving door tour that people can just come through and marvel at it and say, wow, Xerxes, you're pretty awesome. And then at the end of that 6 months, verse 5 says, he then throws a feast lasting for 7 days. So after using his palace as a gallery for 6 months, he throws a week-long meal celebrating what? Is it a religious festival? No, it's celebrating his own greatness. He throws a party for himself. And then in verse 5, it says, all this was done in the court of the garden of the king's palace. When you hear garden, don't think of like a little patch of dirt in the corner of the yard with a few flowers. The Babylonians and the Persians were well known for the immense size and the Eden-like beauty of their gardens. Think about the famous Babylonian hanging gardens of Babylon, which was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. These gardens would often be spread out over several acres. They would include aesthetic geometric designs, ornate architecture, vines and trees growing on the walls, lovely shaded pavilions, and everything from flowers to fruit trees. They would often feature a complex underground irrigation system. And these were such immense worlds of beauty, these gardens, that our word today, paradise, actually comes from the old Persian word for garden. That is how splendid these gardens were, that we still refer to them today when we speak of paradise. When Jesus told the thief on the cross, today you'll be with me in paradise, the Greek word used in the gospel is this Persian loan word, which is quite an enduring testimony to the epic loveliness of Persian gardens. Verse 6. Very lavish descriptions of the architecture, the furniture, the decor. You can go back and read that and just visualize what it would look like. And then in verse 7, it tells us that the king pays everyone's bar tab. You can drink as much as you want. Oh, and by the way, you're going to drink of it out of golden cups. So again, he's treating gold almost as though it's a flippant no big deal. And then verse 8 says there was no compulsion on this drinking. This was an open bar. Drink as much or as little as you want. No compulsion and no restrictions, whatever you desired. Everybody come into my paradise garden and drink as much as you desire. You can imagine the kind of scene that might start taking place when you do this for a week. And then that leads to subpoint C, the vulgar arrogance of Ahasuerus in verses 10 through 12. At this point, the king has shown off every bit of his splendor. He's shown his palace, he's shown his furnishings, his jewels, his fine drinks, his golden cupware. He's feeling about as good about himself as you possibly could. But there's one trophy he hasn't carted out yet. His ravishing queen is in some other part of the palace. We've read that she's hosting a banquet for the women. It doesn't sit right with Xerxes. That means there's a missing gem from his crown. And he simply must make his attendees know every bit of the beauty that he possesses. And so, Vashti must be summoned in all her splendor as a reflection of his. I don't get the vibe that he is doing this out of love for his wife. This is not about his wife, it's all about himself. It's all about, hey, I'm showing off my grandeur through this beautiful woman that all you guys wish you could have. And he's been imbibed with a week's worth of heavy drinking. And so this is basically Xerxes saying, hey, you guys want to see how hot my wife is? Now, in one Jewish tradition, this was actually understood to mean that she was to appear before them only in her crown. Even if that's not what Xerxes intended, he wanted to showcase her for a bunch of drunk guys to leer at. He was already arrogant. Now he's objectifying his wife. This is not the way husbands are to treat their wives. We've learned that masculine strength means honoring and protecting your bride, not exploiting her. Now, we're not told why Vashti refuses. Perhaps she herself had a little bit too much to drink and she's feeling a little contentious. Or maybe she refuses to degrade herself like this. But either way, the man who has all the world, almost literally half the world, in the palm of his hand is not used to being told no. So now he's humiliated. And this humiliation is enough almost to ruin his pomp. This has spoiled his day. This is supposed to be the crown jewel of my glory, and she just killed the grand finale. And oh, he is livid. But he's not quite sure what to do with all this anger. So that leads us to subpoint D, the foolish gullibility of Ahasuerus in verses 13 through 21. The king then gets advice from his 7 advisors. But as you read through their advice, they're not really concerned with his relationship to his wife or even what's right or wrong here. I think if you look at verses 16 to 18, it actually sounds like they might be more worried about their wives giving them a hard time than anything. So if you look at verse 16, it says, not only against the king has Vashti done wrong, but also against all the officials and all the people who are in the province of King Ahasuerus. Verse 18, this very day the noble women of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will say the same to all the king's officials. Well, that includes these guys. It sounds like they're a bit more worried about having to deal with a rowdy wife at home. So their example to the king is, sire, make an example of her. Shut her down in the most severe way imaginable to inspire fear in all the other women in the land. In other words, break up your own marriage in order to make my life easier. And then they play to his kingly fears. They say, this big, sprawling empire you've worked so hard to build, if all these wives start standing up to their husbands, it could plunge the whole thing into chaos. So they're being selfish, they're playing to his fear, but then they also butter him up a little bit in verse 19. They say, let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. These are like his boys at the bar saying, Vashti wasn't good enough for you anyway. There's better fish out in the pond. You deserve the best, and it's not her. So dump her and get someone better. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, they're saying, this makes my job a whole lot easier. Makes it better for me. Now, history and the rest of this book actually tell us Xerxes, for as arrogant as he was indeed very easily led astray by manipulation. I'll go back to Herodotus yet again, because it's actually really helpful to read that, because Herodotus just affirms so much of the character traits of Xerxes that we see in this book. So Herodotus reports, remember I mentioned earlier that Xerxes had invaded Greece. According to Herodotus, Xerxes didn't originally want to invade Greece at all. But one of his cousins, who thought that war could serve his own selfish ambitions, sweet-talked Xerxes a bit. And he said, and I quote, Master, lead an army against Athens, and others shall fear to attack your country. No one except you is worthy to own such a land as Greece. Now, wait, hang on just a sec. An advisor, in order to help themselves, convinced the king that he needed to make an example of someone by clamping down and inspiring fear in such a move that would give this king what he was more worthy of. Where have we seen that manipulation tactic before? It's exactly what the nobles and officials are doing here in chapter 1. Apparently, Xerxes is very prey to this sort of thing. And that wouldn't be the last time either. In just a few chapters, we're going to see Haman doing the exact same thing again. No evidence offered, convincing this king that an entire people group should have genocide committed against them. So Xerxes doesn't seem to do a lot of careful thinking about these things. And that makes him susceptible to bad advice. He's an extremely powerful leader, but he's quite a foolish one. Doesn't have a lot of discernment. And then subpoint E, the cold faithlessness of Ahasuerus in verse 22. After hearing this plan, he basically says, yep, sounds good, do it. Now, one of the effects of sin, you guys, is that it takes good things and twists them. And I want to be very, very deliberate to emphasize here, there is nothing problematic with the idea of men being masters of their home. In fact, I would argue that is God's good design for the home. If this story were a little bit different, we could praise it as killing the outbreak of hyperfeminism. But that's not what's going on here. So there's nothing wrong with men being the master of their homes. They should be. That's God's calling for them. But how are they using the word master here? If master means I can demand that my wife be paraded before leering men and she better do it, and if she doesn't give in to these immoral demands, I'll kick her to the curb and trade her in for a younger, hotter model. That's not what masculine leadership looks like. And yet that is what he's doing here. Now, before we continue to our third and final point, I want to briefly note what an opposite kind of king Jesus is from Ahasuerus. What a contrast between the self-proclaimed King of Kings and the real one. The worldwide dominion that Xerxes craved, only Christ achieves. And he did it through opposite means, through death and resurrection. Think about it. In contrast to Xerxes' selfish pursuit of glamour and fame, Christ willingly surrendered all the splendor of heaven. Christ had in his eternal possession the kind of power that Xerxes would have butchered all the world for. Christ had that by right. And yet, Philippians 2 says he did not count that equality with God a thing to be used for his own selfish advantage, but he emptied himself by taking a servant's nature. Jesus actually surrendered the splendor of heaven to die for his rebellious subjects. And our king came humbly, born in a stable, riding on a donkey, wearing a crown of thorns. The King of Kings does not expose his bride, but he secured her purity and protects her from the jeers of devilish onlookers by taking her shame on himself and covering us with his own robes of righteousness. This King of Kings does not require the counsel of any to fulfill his wise plan, nor was he led astray by the whispered ideas and temptations and manipulations of the devil. He does not write his bride, the church, a certificate of divorce and send her away. He is a faithful groom who loves his people, even at her most disobedient, to the point that he died for her. Jesus stands in stark contrast to the selfish, arrogant rulers who fill the history books. In fact, their flaws make Christ shine all the brighter, and Christ's goodness casts a long shadow over them all, including Xerxes. So Xerxes is not a very upright king. But that brings us to the third and final point today, and I think this is a key move in our understanding of this chapter. God's good plan. Xerxes is selfish, he is arrogant, he is greedy, he is exploitative, he is faithless, he is foolish, and yet God is working through the foolishness and corruption of Xerxes to bring about his good plan. Subpoint A here is the doctrine of providence. One of the ways we could define providence is God's good through our evil. Our confession of faith, the London Baptist Confession, says this in chapter 5. God, the good creator of all things, in his infinite power and wisdom, upholds, directs, arranges, and governs all creatures and things, from the greatest to the least, by his perfectly wise and holy providence. Through a complex arrangement of methods, he governs even sinful actions to accomplish his perfectly holy purposes. Yet, and this is an important yet, he does this in such a way that the sinfulness of their acts arise only from the creature and not from God. Because God is altogether holy and righteous, he can neither originate nor approve of sin. Here we're presented with a biblical mystery, a tension that we have to be okay with. That God is working even through the sinful decisions of mankind to bring about his goodwill. God himself is not the author of sin. God does not make people sin. God abhors sin. And yet, in his mysterious sovereignty, their sin is actually bringing about God's predetermined will. The Belgic Confession puts it as well. The Belgic Confession is about 130 years before the London Baptist Confession. It puts it this way. We believe that this good God, after creating all things, did not abandon them to chance or fortune, but leads and governs them according to his holy will in such a way that nothing happens in this world without God's orderly arrangement. Yet, God is not the author of and cannot be charged with the sin that occurs. For God's power and goodness are so great and incomprehensible that God arranges and does his works very well and justly, even when the devils and the wicked act unjustly. This is saying that human beings have real desires, and we make decisions based on those desires. And people are held accountable for those desires and those decisions. And many times, the desire or the decision or both are crooked. God disapproves of sin. God does not tempt or make anyone sin. And God is the one who holds people accountable for their sin. And yet, in some mysterious way, by desiring and deciding and doing those corrupt things, even erroneously, human agents are actually bringing about God's plan without even realizing it. They're acting in their own interests. They're trying to advance their own kingdom. And yet, they're actually bringing to fruition God's good plan. God brings about his good eternal plan through the actions of humans. That's why there's no such thing as luck or coincidence. That's what the doctrine of providence is all about. It is a mystery that we have to be okay with. And it's a mystery that stands at the heart of this story. It's a mystery that stands at the heart of the story of Joseph, for example, in Genesis. You remember that story? How Joseph's brothers, they commit evil against him. They scheme and they conspire and they treat him unjustly and they make up this horrendous lie and fake his death and they betray their brother and sell him unto slavery. That's a wicked deed. They sinned against their brother. And yet years later, when Joseph was raised by God up to second in command in all of Egypt, and he saves countless untold lives through the way that he manages this terrible famine. Do you remember what he tells his brothers? He says, God sent me here. Those are his exact words. I'm not paraphrasing. Joseph's words, God sent me here. Well, wait a second. The brothers sent you there. They sold you. And yet Joseph was able to say, God sent me here. And here's the mystery of providence. What vehicle did God use to get Joseph there? God's plan is that Joseph would be in Egypt in company with Pharaoh and would be able to save these countless lives. What vehicle, what mode of transport did God use to get Joseph from his father's tent to in front of Pharaoh? God used the sin of Joseph's brothers to get him exactly where God wanted him to be. That's the mystery we see here. Because in subpoint B, let's consider this. Ahasuerus, he is immorally concerned with what? With his own kingdom. As you read through chapter 1, do you think that a concern for God's plan seems to appear anywhere on the king's horizon? Do you think that his prayer is anything like what Jesus taught us to pray? Your kingdom come, your will be done. Whose kingdom is Ahasuerus concerned with here? Whose will is he occupied with? Whose glory and fame and worship dominates his thought and his motivations and his choices? His own. And yet, for every one of those choices, look what it's setting up. It is actually setting up this position where this young Jewish girl will be able to become his bride and will then be used by God to save not just Israel, but the world by preserving the genealogy of Jesus. Ahasuerus doesn't realize it, but his bad motives are actually being used by God to advance God's kingdom in the world. Ahasuerus, in his own intention, is building his own kingdom. God is actually building his. And that's subpoint C. God is using this. God does not approve of sin, but he is working through it and uses it as the vehicle by which he brings about his own kingdom in Christ. This doctrine of providence is the predominant theme in Esther, and it even extends to less than stellar characters like Xerxes. Think about it. He controls more land than anyone else in the world, and yet there's someone more powerful than he. He delights in his power and his wealth. He engages in fleshly revelry. He prostitutes his own wife before crowds of men. He is foolishly and easily manipulated by the schemes of selfish men. He desecrates the covenant of marriage. Not one of those things is positive. We could not look at his resume here in chapter 1 and say he's a noble king. We couldn't even say he just tried his best and came up a little short. We couldn't even say, he messed up a few times, but he repented and Jesus restored him. No, he's just straight up greedy, arrogant, foolish, and faithless. And yet, were it not for all these things, Vashti would never have been removed, Esther would never have become queen, and the Israelites would have ended up exterminated. Which means, again, the lineage of the Messiah would have been exterminated. Which means what? God would have broken his promises to Abraham and to David and all the Israelites. God would now be a mistrusted liar. Jesus would never have been born. He never would have died. He never would have rose again. You and I would be sitting as condemned men and women before God right now, doomed to eternal death. God brought Esther to the throne to preserve his people and his promise to bring Jesus by means of Ahasuerus' corruption, without God himself committing any sin. That is a mind-blowing mystery that I don't even claim to have somewhat wrapped my head around. And at the end of the day, I would argue we're not meant to totally grasp it. Instead, it is to lead us to worship, to marvel at the goodness of our God. And this would not be the last time that God worked through the selfish ambition of rulers and kings to bring about his good plan. Before we conclude, let's think about this one. In Luke chapter 2, it says that in those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. And all went to be registered, each to his own town. Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth, to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David. God had given a prophecy many hundreds of years before that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. Now, how are Mary and Joseph going to get to Bethlehem? What is the means by which they go there? Caesar Augustus, the Roman emperor, issues a decree that each man has to go back to his hometown. Now, when Caesar Augustus issued that decree, was he thinking about the kingdom of God? Did his ambitions have anything to do with the glory of God or the reign of the Messiah? No, whose kingdom was he all about? His own. It was a diplomatic move by a Roman emperor to consolidate his own power in the kingdom. And yet God was using that to actually usher in his own kingdom. Final example, Acts chapter 4. Verses 27 and 28, the apostles are praying, and they say to the Lord, in this city, Jerusalem, there were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, to do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place. When Herod and Pontius Pilate agreed to crucify Jesus, whose kingdom were they thinking about? Whose glory were they concerned with? Their own. And yet through those very means, God was actually bringing about his plan that Jesus, the suffering servant, would be crucified for you and for me in our stead and then rise again 3 days later. Isn't God incredible? The wise way that he orchestrates these things. And so as we get ready to wrap up, I'd like for us to leave with these two applications. As you think about the gospel, think about the masterful planning of God to bring it to fruition. Think about how even here, hundreds of years before Jesus is born, God is orchestrating world events and God is working through history and even corrupt rulers to bring about his good plan so that Jesus would be born and that you and I would be saved by his grace. What wisdom of God. Secondly, I don't know what political twists and turns lie in the future in our nation or in our world. I don't know which nations will rise and fall before the Lord returns. I don't know what corruption we might see, what abuses might transpire, and those aren't good things. But isn't it comforting to know that we can trust somehow God is working through all those details to advance his kingdom in the world? And that can give us peace even as the world is at war.